Welcome back to my channel. My name is Jody, and today I am working on um, a red crinoline quilt pattern called Davenport, and the quilt finishes, I believe, 81 by 94. And so what I'm working on today are these. I'm not even sure what the block name is, but it's this. Let me hold one up for you. I've got one finished. So it is this block, and I won't be able to give you the measurements because, you know, it's a pattern owned by someone else, but I'm going to show you and, excuse me, maybe show you some of the tips I use to get my block together. So this block is made up of squares, rectangles, flying geese, and half square triangles. So the first thing I'm working on are the flying geese block. So let me show you how I make my flying geese. So I take my rectangle, which I refer to this as my base, and I have marked on the back of my light fabric a diagonal line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up. It's on here. And I make sure to line up the sides. And this line, I'm going to sew just a hair away from the center of my base. So along this line, I'm going to sew about a needle's width over. So here's one I've already done. You can see my pencil line, and my sewing line is just below it, to where you could put maybe a thread between the two. So I want to move the camera down and I'll show you sewing. I've got two left to do. So I'll show you how I put on the corners of my flying geese. So hold on. Okay, let me move these out of the way. I have my rectangle and my square with the diagonal line. I'm going to line this up. And then when I sew, I'm going to sew just a hair to the left, towards the outer side of my block. So let me put this through. And I will do one more. And I usually start sewing from the center of my base out to the corner. That way my machine doesn't eat up my corner. So that's one tip. Let me put this one through. So let me take one off and I'll show you how I trim these. So when I take these off, I'm going to fold this over so I can see it here, so that when it folds over, it covers behind, so I don't have any kind of gap. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim away this excess fabric. So doing this sew and flip method, there is a little bit of waste, but it's not that much. So let me trim this off. Get my rotary blade. Now I'm going to cut 1/4 inch away from my seam. Get rid of this. And so instead of going and putting on the second side, I trim mine. And what I do is I take my base. It is the original size that this should end up at. So I'm going to measure off of it. So I'm going to lay this down. And I know my size. So I'm going to lay this down on my rectangle and no one is perfect, so there will be a tiny bit that I have to trim off. Turn this over here. So I had to trim off that little bit. So now I am ready to sew my second side on. So let me get my square with the diagonal seam marked. And I'm going to lay this across. And now I'm ready to sew to the outer side of my flying geese. So my line, my needle is going to go just to, it'll be your right here. So let me sew this one from the middle out. Sew this on. And I have my length set to 2 on my machine. Get this off here. Get my scissors. So again, you can see my line and my stitching is right here, just a needle width away. So I'm going to make sure it covers. And it does. I don't see the fabric behind it. So now I can trim away this little bit of excess. I trim that away. 1/4 inch away. Get rid of that. And now I'm going to give it a little bit of a press with the iron. And a press, not an iron. I just take the iron and push down. So there's the block. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, remember that center goose is my base. So I'm going to measure off of it. So the new piece I added, I'm going to remeasure to the exact size that it should be. And then I want to trim. If there's anything to be trimmed. Yep, a little bit. So now my flying goose is the correct size it should be. I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance up here. And so I need to make a whole bunch of these. And then next I'm going to sew my half square triangles. And I am using these, let me cover up the measurement. They're called star singles. And I'm going to paper piece my half square triangles. I've never used these before. This is the first time I'm using them, and I like them. So it's kind of a pain in the butt to tear the paper away, but it makes a lot, it's quicker. I don't have to draw the diagonal lines, and basically I get this back up. I've got one here done. Let me cover up the measurements again. So it looks like this, and they have numbered, like here's a 1, so that my 1 seam, I sew 1, 2, 3, and it goes all the way around, and so the back will look like this. And so I have a tip for these. When I lay the paper out, I put the light fabric next to the paper, and I take a glue stick and I just dab a dot on all 4 sides. I lay my light fabric down, and then I put the darker fabric on top so that it doesn't shift behind there. And then I sew. So I'll show you one of them next. Okay, so here I have let me cover the size here real quick. My star singles papers to make 8 at a time half square triangles. So this is what the paper looks like. I've marked out my sizes here, and you can see there is 1, 2, 3. It numbers your seams, and you will sew on the seams that have the arrow and the dashes. and we cut on the solid line. So I turn this over, and I started sewing this and I ran out of bobbin thread, so I have to redo this one. So I will take my glue stick and I put a dab in the 4 corners. Then I take my light fabric face up and I center it on here. So now my fabric is on here. It won't move. It won't shift on me. And then I will take my darker fabric face down and center it. So now I can turn this over, and I'm going to start with my number 1 seam. I'm going to sew on the dotted line in the direction of the arrow shown. I shorten my seam length to 1.6, and let's sew around this block or this paper. And you sew and you stop on the line. There's a dot at the end of each line. I pivot and sew the next line. Pivot. I'm on number 3. Back on the dot here. Line 5. On number 6. Two more. And then my last one. Cut the thread. So I've sewn all the way around, and the back will look like this. So let me give it a quick press here, just to set my seams. And so a trick or a tip that I have with these is I will cut the center line, but I don't cut this outside line yet. So let me cut these center straight lines. So remember, you cut on the straight line, not the dotted. Cut that one. Move that away. And I want to cut this on the line. And so let me move these out of the way. So now I'm going to cut the diagonal line, the solid line. And so the reason I put the light fabric against the paper is because when you open it up, you can press to the dark, like that. And so here's another one, the other side, press to the dark. And so the reason, let me give these a quick press here real quick. Okay. So the reason that I don't cut the outside is because these are so close to the size you need that I like to have a little bit of excess on the outside, if that makes sense, just in case my fabric shifted a little from the line. And so you'll see when I trim these two. And then the next tip I have is I use, where'd it go? There it is. My Bloc Loc ruler. Love this ruler for half square triangles. It's got a little groove here that sits against the seam you sew. So first I will trim up the one that didn't have the excess paper cut off. So let me trim this one real quick. And you'll see the difference of what comes off. There's this. Flip it over, trim the other side. So here's my finished half square triangle, and this was all the ease way I have. So not much ease way, and there's 8 of these per paper. So 4 of them will be really close to trimming. This one, I've got wiggle room. So I can sit this on here. I can square it up here, one side, the other. And so I'm getting a lot more that I can trim off. Let me trim the other side now. Like this. And trim that. I've got my finished block, but I was able to trim off this much fabric to make it the correct size. So you don't have to do it that way. I do just as a safeguard. So when I sew these, I don't cut this outside line. Everything else on the inside, the straight lines or solid lines, I will cut until I trim. So I hope that makes sense. So here's another one. This side won't have much to trim. This one, I've got room to budge. I'll cut another one for you here and trim it up. So I cut on the solid line. And again, because my light was next to the paper, I can turn this over and easily press to the dark. If I can get a hold of it here. There, I can press to the dark easy. And since this was the outside, I've got wiggle room in case my fabric shifted on my paper. Let me give it a quick press. Press this one. And you press down, you don't iron. So I'll trim the inside piece. And they usually come out just enough. No wiggle room. So you gotta be careful when you sew on that line. Flip it over, trim the other side. So there's that. There's that little bit fudge factor. That block's done. Trim the one that I didn't cut the outside line. I got wiggle room. I can move my ruler around. Let me trim this one. There's that. Oop, didn't cut that one all the way. Awkward angle to cut here. I can flip it. My ruler can slide. I've got room. And there's that. Perfect size. But I was able to trim away a little bit more than this just by cutting just the inside on the line and leaving the outside lines uncut. So I hope that makes sense. So when you're doing these, you cut all these inside and I leave this outside square uncut until I trim. So that's my tip for making the half square triangles. So I have sewn these rows together. So far I've got one more piece in the columns to put on. I wanted to show you how the pattern has you press alternating seams. So one goes this way, one goes that way. And that's so when you go to sew the rows together, your seams will nest. So everything is webbed together. So I'm going to take this piece. It goes up here, and I keep my papers in until I'm ready to put the piece into my block, just to keep my seam stable. I carefully rip the paper out, and I talk a lot to myself when I put my blocks together, just so I can keep everything straight. And what I do is I remind myself, dark goes to my top right, the first and the last row, I put a back stitch in. So I will put the first piece on for this column. I match up my seams, and I'm going to take 2 stitches, let me line up my side here, take 2 stitches and back stitch 1. I do that just so my block, the ends don't, the seams don't break open. So then I'll sew this on. And when I put this on, I sew so that the needle is in the last, it stays in the fabric that just went on. I hope that makes sense. So when I put this piece on, let me get the paper off here. A little piece on here. When I sew this on, I'm going to leave my needle in the very end of this piece. So it goes to my top right. I'll add a piece on. Sew this piece on. And stop. So it's still under the needle. I'll take my next piece and put it on. Now line that up with my flying goose beak. Put that on. Gotta be careful not to take too big of a seam because I don't want to chop my beak off. Stop with the needle in the fabric. Take my next piece on. Take the paper out. That's the only bad thing about doing the paper is because you got to take the papers out. So put this piece on and stop. The dark is in the bottom right for me. So stop at the end of it. Take my last little corner piece. And since this one is my last piece in this column, I'm going to do a back stitch at the end. Dark to my bottom right. Gotta remind myself. Line up my edges. Sew it on. Get to the end. Back stitch once. And off. And normally I would have another block ready to go. So I'm going to peek at my goose. Ooh, he's got a beak. I didn't cut him off. So I press the direction that the pattern tells me to. It's every other row goes one direction, and then every other row goes the opposite direction so that my rows will nest. So let me give this a quick press real quick. When I press, I don't iron. And then I do a quick glance at the bottom to make sure I don't have any seams flipped. So you can see my seams are going opposite directions. So now I will take Let's start with the middle one. So we'll lay this over. And since I did the webbing, I don't have to pin. So I match up my beginning. I will go in 2 stitches, 1, 2, back stitch 1, and then all my seams should butt up nicely. So these are my pins, my fingers. So I hold my seams and sew. Get ready for the last one. Line that last end up because I'm going to back stitch at the end. Sew this on. Get to the end, back stitch once. And I'll take this out and I'm going to peek. And a little thread there, but my goose beak's there. It's got a little thread there stuck in. There we go. And so these all go out. So let me press this real quick. And so now we will sew this to this. Two stitches, back stitch once. Hold my corner or peak or my seams together. Line up the end here. And I don't just line up the corner, I line up the whole thing because I want a straight edge. Get to the end, back stitch once, cut my thread. This will go out. Notice no pins. My points are matching. Press this real quick. And another thing I use is, let me take the camera up here a little bit, is I have my press. I have this little furring strip. I'm too cheap to buy one of the clappers, so I just use a furring strip. It works. So as you can see, my pieces are lined up. So I have 2 more seams. Do them real quick for you, real here, or right here. Line up the whole, can't see, sorry. Bring this back down. I line up the whole edge. Take 2 seams, 1, 2, backspace 1. And then it's ready to rock and roll. Here we go. Line at the end, the whole edge. That might end here. Get all the way to the end. Get to the edge. Back stitch once and off. Press this. And I will use my little furring strip clapper. Get that hot. Press that down. And one last seam. Here we go. Line up a whole edge. 2 stitches. Backspace once, back stitch once. And ready to go. Trying to flip open. Okay. My seam tried to flip open. Okay, here we go. Line up my whole edge. And since everything has been webbed together, should be good to go. Get to the end, backspace once, backspace, backstitch, and off. Let me check my goose. He's good. Money, money, money. And press, let me press him with my cheek clapper. Takes the heat, or I don't use steam. So I flip it over, make sure no seams have turned, no pins used, and all my points match. This is going to be so pretty. I got this one, I've got this colorway, and so I need 6 of each colorway. There's 30 of these blocks. There are 30 of these type of blocks, but in 5 different colorways. So I'm getting there. So when I get ready to put on my side triangles and my how do you call it, the offset, or my setting squares, I'll record that too. So I hope you enjoyed. Hope I didn't confuse you. Have a great day. Stay safe. Bye.